So you're halfway through your day, and it's a great privilege and pleasure for me to join you to talk a bit about loneliness and isolation. You can imagine my delight when an email came from Learn to say, "Dear Dr. Foggie, we appreciate your experience of loneliness and isolation." But that was professionally meant. So my name's Janet Foggie, and I work as the Pioneer Minister for the Presbytery of Stirling. And Pioneer Ministry is a new form of ministry. I don't have a church. There are no pews, there's no organ, there's no building. I suppose when the church set out its vision of a church without walls, Pioneer Ministry is taking that 100% to heart. And it's a ministry of outreach and also of meeting people where they are at, in which case then looking at loneliness and isolation actually fits very well with what I do, and I'm going to talk a bit about my work. So if we could go to the next slide. This is a picture of the chaplaincy at the University of Stirling where I work. And my Pioneer Ministry is also connected to a role as honorary chaplain for the Church of Scotland at the University of Stirling. And one of the things I'd like to say first when we're thinking about loneliness and isolation is just to let go of those little prejudices we have about who may or may not be the type of person who would be lonely or isolated. In actual fact, if we look at a picture like this, it's very hard to see who might feel lonely or who might be feeling isolation. Often it's an easy thing to mask. It's an easy thing to mask. And so when we're working with loneliness and isolation, I think, for me anyway, one of the first things I need to drop is my judgment as to who may or may not be a lonely person. And there can be some real surprises along the way if we're open to the possibility that any of the students in this picture could feel lonely from time to time. And perhaps any of us can feel lonely from time to time. The other thing that I want to say is that the literature on loneliness and isolation doesn't deal with the spiritual loneliness that we as Christians are very comfortable with. The idea of Jesus going off by himself, of time in the wilderness, the thoughts of pilgrimage or a journey of loneliness, which is a spiritual journey, that isn't covered by the literature about loneliness and isolation. They almost always look at loneliness and isolation in a negative light. But if we're going to be true to the Bible and true to the Christian journey, we all know that often in times of loneliness, times of being alone, a time of physical isolation, there we meet God. And so we're never alone where God is. And that is a reality for Christians in their faith. But it's not frequently reflected in the literature. I have the next slide. So the next little prejudice we want to drop, if I could call it that, is the idea that loneliness and isolation are always tied together. In actual fact, there's quite a difference between the two ideas of loneliness and isolation. So if we take loneliness first, these are just going to come up as bullet points. Loneliness is a feeling, it's a perception, and it's often an anxiety. So loneliness can be something that we think we will feel. For example, people might think, I don't want to go to that group, or I don't want to do that activity because I might be lonely when I get there. Loneliness can be a projection into the future. Loneliness can be a perception. So someone can be surrounded by friends, seem to be always busy, but they themselves perceive a loneliness. And loneliness is always a feeling. It's always something that we feel. And I think, again, when we are talking about pastoral care, feelings are never to be disregarded. Feelings are paramount. So it's not the case that because it's a feeling, it doesn't matter. Quite the reverse. Because it's a feeling, this is pastorally one of our top priorities. Isolation's a wee bit different. Isolation is a physical state. It might be a lack of transport, a lack of money, a lack of mobility. Isolation is a loss of a relationship, perhaps a relationship breakdown or a bereavement. And isolation can also occur in company. This is particularly common of bereavement. So if a person loses their life partner, they may find all sorts of other relationships that enable and support them, but they will have the physical isolation from the one person who was their partner for life, and that can't be changed. It's not going to be changed by any amount of social interaction. Can I just look for some nods? Am I making sense? Good. So fundamentally then, we have loneliness, the feeling, the perception, the anxiety, the fear of loneliness, and on the other side we have isolation, the actual state of being isolated. And while the two interact, we're going to hold them in balance this afternoon. So some people like graphs, some people don't like graphs. The next slide is for all the people in the room who like graphs. The joy for everyone who doesn't like graphs is this is the only slide with graphs on it. So if this isn't for you, hold your breath. We're going to get on through. We will survive it. Generational difference is often discussed when we talk about loneliness and isolation. And what we actually have is a really complex picture. So I think we need to hold, when we think about generational difference, always hold on to the thought that anyone can feel lonely, and also that loneliness can be a temporary state. So just those two thoughts are quite useful when we're looking at the generations. But in fact, this graph shows to us that there's a difference between feelings of loneliness and isolation. And in this graph, they understand isolation as, do you go out socially at least once a week? Do you go out socially at least once a week? And church would count, folks. Church counts. And then, do you feel lonely most or all of the time? And you'll see in the graph that there's a big gap between the people who feel lonely most or all of the time and people who are seeing someone once a week. And that is also interesting in that once a week isn't that often. It's not that often. And I wonder, when they were taking these statistics, if that's actually the best indicator. And I gave an example when I was writing the pieces for the book of a lady that I knew when I worked in the parish. And she had multiple sclerosis. She was bedbound for 15 years at the end of her life. And she had the most amazing network of people, home helps, carers, neighbours, a loving family, people who came in and out. And in all of that interaction, when she passed away, everybody came and told me what she did for them. Everyone told me what she did for them. And so she was housebound, she was vulnerable, she was extremely disabled, but she was neither lonely nor isolated. In actual fact, she was a comfort to many other people who felt lonely and isolated. But she didn't get out to socialise, ever. So she would have mucked up this graph. That's enough statistics. I want to move on. Let's move to the next slide. So I want to have a time for us to talk together, and I want to do that around this text. I'm just going to put my glasses on. Right. So let's take a minute then to hear the word of God. This is from the Gospel of Matthew. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little further, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't you men watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were so heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed a third time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come, and the Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." So I want us to think about that story, that powerful story of Jesus feeling the feeling of loneliness, feeling the feeling of loneliness. And I would like, if we want to just break into 2s or 3s, just people you feel comfortable with, break into 2s or 3s and see if you can identify for yourself a time when you felt you required human company, had a real need for company. And then once you've had a little bit of time talking about that, I'd like then us just to think about who was there for you in that situation. So if we're not going to take too long on this, but if we have a kind of 5 minutes chatting together, just about a time when you felt personally you had a need for company, and then who was there for you in that situation. And I would like to say as well, before we do that talking, take time to choose what to share and keep yourself safe. So share, but do that in a way where you feel safe, and listen to each other in that safety. So on you go. So I don't want to share in a big group what we just shared there with each other, but it gives us a place to begin when we think about the loneliness of others. A good place to begin is thinking about a time in our own lives when we had that sensation, when we felt that feeling. And when we think about coming alongside people who might be feeling lonely, it's good to remind ourselves of how it felt when someone came alongside us. There's a couple of things I want to draw out from the Gethsemane passage that would be helpful, I think, as we move forward. The first is that the disciples failed Jesus in this passage. And often loneliness is the result of a wider societal failure. Now, we have a choice in that moment when we see that there's a failure. We can either choose to campaign, and that can be a very good thing, to change something. A good example might be campaigns to change bus routes. Often the change of a bus route, while it may seem a really small and insignificant thing, the change of a bus route can make all the difference between meeting your friends once a week and not meeting friends once a week. So those sorts of things are key. The other thing we can do when we see a failure is not to campaign on the big issues, but to fix it in a small way. to find a little local solution that works for now. And sometimes that is as valuable and as important as trying to change things in a big way. The second thing I would say about the story of Gethsemane is that the cup of suffering was not taken from our Lord Jesus Christ. This is not a story with, at least in the short term, a happy ending. And one thing that Jesus asked of his friends was not that they sat right up close to him, hearing every jot and tittle of his prayer. What he wanted was people to be there for him, but at a distance that mattered to Jesus. And I think when we're coming alongside people who may feel lonely or isolated, it's important to remember that what they might want from us might not be that we learn their whole life history, everything about them. I had a counselling friend who used to say, we don't always want to get all our emotional spaghetti onto the table. And so if we find someone who articulates that they are feeling lonely, that is not necessarily an invitation to us to learn everything there is to learn about their lives. Do you see what I'm saying? That actually sometimes within walking alongside loneliness, there's a companionable distance, a safe space that we would accompany someone in that loneliness journey with. And finally, if Jesus modeled for us what it is to be excruciatingly lonely in a time of extreme suffering, in the knowledge and face of his own death, then we know that should that moment arise for us, Christ has walked this path before us. And that, to me anyway, is a comfort. So, having said all the heavy, difficult things, how do we actually tackle loneliness and isolation day to day? And it may well be that in rummaging through your brain cells for a time that you felt lonely, a big one is leaving home. That moment when we first leave home, and for all we want to tell our parents, I have got this, I can sort my socks, mostly. I know how to use a washing machine, I can boil a kettle, don't interfere, oh for goodness sake, Mum. Underneath it all, there's a child starting a new life, and there are quite natural and inevitable feelings of loneliness. And as we were talking about isolation, when a student leaves home, there is a physical isolation from the home in which they were raised, where those who cared for them and loved them were there every day. Students then, what's the way to do it? Do you walk onto campus and say, excuse me, are you feeling lonely? I don't tend to be honest. I think one of the key things about working to negate loneliness and isolation is like Fight Club in the movie Fight Club, not to talk about loneliness and isolation. So that is not the place we start. Can I have the next slide, please? So there's two basic threads to the way I work with students, or perhaps there are three. There's a theory of caring for the world called permaculture, and permaculture has three principles: earth care, fair share, and people care. Earth care, fair share, and people care. Now, for those of us who have a Christian faith, we've heard these before. We've heard these before. Love the world that God has given to us, the stewardship of the world. And then people care. Love your neighbour as you love yourself. And fair share. If any one of you is asked for your shirt, give your coat as well. And no one should have two shirts when those in the world are needing one. These principles are very easily and strongly connected to the Christian faith. So working with students, I take those principles of permaculture and we look at looking after our planet and doing so in a way that also looks after ourselves. I took 8 students to make their own garden bench, and here's one of them working away. This is a Greenwood project. It's about doing something tactile with a resource that is beautiful. It's about looking after the planet, and it's also about spending time together in... It's okay, you're cool, don't worry. I'm really sorry you can't come out the back of the room. So, yeah, making a garden bench, it's a really good activity where we can talk together and work together. Do you want to give me the next slide? On the University of Stirling campus, we have a student community garden. These are the students gardening. And again, when we're working together, if we're digging or weeding or growing things, we're looking after the planet, we're looking after ourselves. And we also have an opportunity to talk, because it's amazing how our mind's free when our hands are busy. Once our hands are busy, our minds are free then to chat. And the garden is very carefully a space where everyone is equal, everyone is welcomed, and everyone is respected. The garden also gives us an opportunity to meet people across what might otherwise be boundaries. So people who are in different classes meet there, people who have different backgrounds, different walks of life. And it's a place where many of the international students can meet students from Scotland. One of the things about universities today that we need to remember is that the student population in university today is not what it was when I was a young undergraduate. When I was an undergraduate, 7% of Scotland's population went to university. 20 years before that, it was 5% of Scotland's population went to university. And those of us who went to university had grants, yep, that dates me, and we had the opportunity to do something rare, something that was respected, generally speaking, in wider society, and something which we could be fairly confident would lead to employment. Today, 50% of Scotland's youth goes to university, and the opportunities that there are for them at the end of that university career are not guaranteed, not remotely guaranteed. And I know that we hear in the news of workplaces closing far more frequently than we would like. The Michelin tire factory in Dundee was in the news just last week. The environment into which our young people are graduating is a very different environment. And then instead of loans, we give our young people, instead of grants, we give our young people loans. So there's very good research that connects debt and anxiety. In the adult population, if we have debts that we find it hard to foresee we will repay, that is a major cause of anxiety. And what on earth possessed us to give our young adults debts and then think somehow that wouldn't affect their mental health? It's beyond belief. But anyway, the fact is that a student from England nowadays is leaving university with a debt of around £55,000. And a student from Scotland is leaving university with a debt of around £18,000 to £23,000. So debt is a major factor in why students feel anxious. It's not unreasonable for them to feel anxious in the face of that debt. And 33% of our student population has mental well-being or mental health diagnosis, has difficulties with their mental health. And that is not because for any reason that they're less able to cope than we are. It's because they're carrying social pressures that we do not carry. Okay? Next slide. For some students, this is exacerbated by being on the other side of the globe. So as well as the community garden, I run a sewing group. Now, Pioneer Minister for the Church of Scotland, what on earth is she doing running a sewing group? I like to think of Dorcas. I like to think of Dorcas. And when Dorcas dies, the widows who received the clothes that Dorcas made gather, and they say to Peter, gonna no do this. You can't let Dorcas go. We need her. And sure enough, Peter kicks them out the room, prays with Dorcas, and God restores her life to her. The sewing group is a lifeline, and sewing has its own, like gardening, has its own language. So if we come to the sewing group, but English isn't our first language, but we know the vocabulary of sewing, it's a place to meet. Does that make sense? It's a place where we can share. And it's also then an opportunity for students to make the most of a limited budget. So the student that you see here in the picture is fixing an evening dress that she bought in a charity shop. And she came in, we'd gone round her twice, we sorted it, and she went out looking $1 million. Honestly, you could not tell that we had taken a needle to that frock. And that is so empowering. For students who are carrying debt, who are anxious, who are struggling, the empowerment that comes from altering their own clothes is really genuine and worth something. So the sewing group is twice a week, and I'm looking at 5 or 6 students coming each session. Sometimes just for once, they might just come with a pair of jeans and say, show me how to fix this. Sometimes they come week after week and interact in that way. If we have the next picture. So one of the things I've recently done that has been quite fabulous, unexpectedly fabulous, comes from a need. So when Jesus sent out the 72, he didn't give them a budget and a company car and a briefcase. He said, go with sandals and don't take spares, just go into the world with what you don't have. And the fact of the matter is I can't knit. I really can't knit. I nearly brought you a hat that I didn't knit, but I decided not to embarrass myself. And I can't crochet. So there were students coming to me saying, oh, you've got a sewing group. That's fabulous. Can we knit and crochet? And I said, well, yes, of course you can, but I can't help you. So they said, well, we don't need taught to knit and crochet. We need resources. And we set up the crochet box. The wool is donated. All the cloth for the sewing group is donated by members of the local church. And if you know someone who has a fabric stash and can't use it anymore, or has inherited it from someone they love and would like it to be well used, the University of Stirling is always glad to hear from you. And similarly so with the crocheting resources. And the crochet has broken down a barrier I could not see. The crochet has broken down a barrier I could not see. So because I can't crochet, I didn't think of it. Do you see what I mean? And I think it's really important when we're doing pastoral care for loneliness and isolation that we don't assume just because someone is lonely or feeling isolated that they are talentless. Do you know, it doesn't follow that they don't have huge numbers of fantastic things to offer. It's just that for the moment, they're feeling a bit isolated. And the other thing that the crochet has done, because the box sits in chaplaincy all the time, even when I'm not there, is a couple of very mentally unwell and vulnerable students have made contact because they picked up the wool and then they wanted to say thank you, and then a pastoral conversation has ensued. So that is crochet, breaking down social barriers, but also just that understanding that sometimes the barriers are barriers we can't see. So the other thing that I want to say about the sewing and the crocheting, and to a lesser extent the gardening, is that one of the most creative ways the church can break down barriers of isolation is bringing people together who might not otherwise meet. And that has been the case for many years in Stirling with meals. There's people in the local church who will take students for a meal and give them a home environment for a while. That works very well. But the donors of the fabric have also been very interesting. And again, I hadn't expected this. I hadn't gone out looking for this. But I've gone to collect fabric from a lady who has arthritis and can't sew anymore, and was able to tell me her story and talk to me about what it meant to miss that hobby that she'd so much enjoyed. And I had little green bug eyes of envy. She has a sewing room in her house, and all the fabric beautifully folded. And what a gift that lady was to me and to God and to those students, because then through that story, not only did she give us her fabric and her patchwork cutting squares, but eventually also called me and said I could have her sewing machine. And that is just such a kindness. Another one was a gentleman whose wife was very keen on patchwork, and she passed away, and he felt he couldn't touch these things. They had been so much of her, and they spoke to him of her. And so I was able to do a home visit, and talk through how the students would use her materials and what good use they would be put to. And then when we made a quilt to give to Startup Stirling to be used for the homeless, able then to speak to him about the fact that her fabric lived on, and in a way that had now helped a whole chain of people, from the student who sewed it to the person who's going to receive the finished item. So when we start to unpack loneliness and isolation, who knows what good will come of that? Because the riches, the talents are out there. We're not walking into a desert when we go to speak to lonely and isolated people. We're walking into a rich and varied environment where there's a great many good things to come from those interactions. I want to turn now to the third section, and if we could have the next slide, please. This is another opportunity for people to talk, and you might want to move into slightly larger groups this time. So maybe if you just kind of look around, and you know, this session does what it says in the tin. I don't want to see anyone left out. Okay, so have a look around, and what I really want to talk about is church. And I want to talk about, if you think about what I've said about the university and the students, what are the hidden barriers? What are the barriers you can't see? What are the places where people might be in company but still have a feeling of loneliness? Okay? What can we do to overcome that? And what are the ways in which we can make church accessible, not just in the sense of wheelchair accessible or accessible for people who have a need that we can see, but how do we think about those invisible barriers? I'll give you a good example. In the church where I was a minister, when I first arrived there, the cup of tea after church rarely had a spare chair. And that was something the church was very proud of. Oh, we never have a spare chair at the cup of tea. But how hard is it for a visitor if there's never a spare chair? So we need to think about just what are those invisible barriers? What are the things, and we fixed that, by the way, but just to let you know. But what are the things that we can do to enable people who might be feeling lonely or have an anxiety of loneliness in accessing church? So get into slightly larger groups. I'm going to give you a little bit longer, so we'll take 10 minutes, and I will ask the groups to feed back a bit. We might not get around to everyone. So if there's someone in your group who just looks tremendously efficient, nobble them to take some notes and feedback. Okay, off you go. I'm sorry to call your discussion to an end, because you were obviously solving all the problems of the church. We were going to have that done. I think if I'd allowed you another 5 minutes, weren't we? Yeah. As it is, though, we'll just have to put some of this on to future thoughts and talks. But I would like to hear back from you, at least some idea of what the social barriers you think there might be, and what sort of solutions there might be to them. So would anyone like to volunteer what their group had to say?
ideas that we're working, to some extent anyway, we all had the difficulty of identifying who was lonely. And with confidentiality and things like that, you can't expect doctors or health visitors or people like that to divulge it just in a way. You just have to keep your eyes and ears open. And in some circumstances, that's quite difficult.
So if everyone's hearing, that's the question of identifying who might be lonely and how we do that. Now, in actual fact, in my work in the University of Stirling, that is something I do not do. I do not do it. So,
But you don't have to.
well, no, I just was wanting to explain that a little bit. I think the thing is to work on things that work and allow people to self-identify. Now, isolation's different. We can identify who's isolated. Look at the bus routes. Look at who used to come to church and can't. But then the isolated people, like my lady with MS, might not necessarily be lonely, but they would be delighted to hear from you if they're genuinely feeling isolation. But loneliness itself, I think, we have to self-report. We have to say, this is how I'm feeling. Does that make sense? So that's a difficult issue for the church, is hearing the stories of loneliness when they do come up and identifying the isolated. That's the key one, the doctor's surgery. The people that used to tell the minister who needed a visit can't say anymore because of data protection. So identifying the isolated is from that group. Any other groups got any thoughts?
Well, we understood something of what you were saying is, what are the barriers that, and when they're visible or not visible? And our group, a couple of people here spoke quite favourably about leaving those doors open, because sometimes the doors are a barrier, and offering ministries that flow outside of the church, like to people who are homeless, for example, and to children who wouldn't come on a Sunday, but might come to a fun club during the week, or would come for, when school holidays are on, come for like a school dinner. So that was breaking down barriers and finding a way to encourage people to see the church as something that hasn't got those brick walls, those big stone walls, and this big solid door that is closed most of the week.
Yep, so being open Monday to Friday, yeah.
In a similar sort of vein, I think, we're looking at, we do have buildings that other organisations don't necessarily have. So using those to offer activities that are not strictly Christian focused, but presented in a faithful fashion, be it a film night or a crafts and activities, using the facilities that we've got, doing things, if necessary, asking others, we've got some space and time, what would you like to do with it?
Mm-hmm. So that's, I mean, again, using this space, that would be like my crochet model. You know, putting something out and saying, well, here's the resource, let's see what comes. And of course, many churches are very, very good at that. And I know that there's 2 points of view. So some ministers will say, Hall Let's kills a church. And other ministers will say, Hall Let's are our opportunity to be here for our community. And it depends a bit how we look at that. But if we're looking specifically at loneliness and isolation, then everything from the Boys Brigade, the Girls Brigade, the Scouts, the Brownies, the Guides, whatever is bringing people into our building, meetings, organisations, then that is doing that thing of making social networks which enable people to engage. So that's very true, using the building in that way.
We were discussing the fact that even in church, people can be lonely, and people don't necessarily want charity. They don't want you to come up and say, oh, here is the Lord, let me give you something. People need to be needed and wanted. So sometimes to break the barrier, you see like somebody looking quite lonely, but they're relatively physically fit. You might go and say, could you possibly give me a hand to move these chairs? I'm really struggling here.
Mm-hmm.
That way you get them on board and engage them. And then you can maybe spot somebody else across from the corner and say, could you give me a hand? And then leave them to work together. You're breaking a barrier. like you, we have an arts and crafts group, and like you, I cheerfully started mine up, and I don't know a thing about knitting or sewing or crocheting. But I got chatting to ladies, and we had one 91-year-old who was really quite lonely and isolated. When I got chatting to her, I discovered she used to own a crochet knitting shop and teach lessons. I said, would you teach us?
Yes, yeah. So that's a lovely point, yes. That people will come and teach, they can share knowledge.
I wonder if one of the principles there then is to not do a job by yourself that you could do with somebody else. So that, you know, when someone, if we're doing the dishes in the church kitchen and someone puts their head around the door and says, can I help? We always say, no, I've got it, I'm fine, that's okay.
Yeah, so I've got, oh, listen, touched a sore spot. Can I bring you back? 2 words then we need to think about that are invisible barriers, okay? 2 words, ownership and rota, okay? That's my 2 words for you. So if we have too much ownership of our own church, however good that may be, it can make it difficult for us to allow new people to get established as part of the church community. And if we have a rota, however good that rota may be, it means that the on-spec drop-by, just come to church for one Sunday person isn't easily absorbed into what's going on. And there's a Church of England congregation that I remember seeing on, I think, Facebook, some social media page, who got rid of their rotas. And every Sunday when you came to church, there was a bowl at the door with chips in it, and each chip had a job on it. Why do we laugh? The fabulous thing about that is you could be first time ever in the door of that church and taking up the collection. You're not sitting there thinking, oh, I don't know if I'm allowed, I don't know if I'm, do you know, so I think one of the things we need to think about invisible barriers is to think in the mindset of the person who's new, because they're probably just as able to dry a teacup as the person who always does it. So that's your point, isn't it? That's exactly right. One more. Oh, sorry.
I think one of the concepts to remember is the church is not about the building, it's about the people. And it's not just about Sunday as well. The mission is about the mission and even simply about church on Sunday.
So not just the building, but the people, and not just Sunday, but all week. Admirably brief. I think we can take one last then. Did you have a point?
I was just about to pick up on what you were saying there, and I think there are times when the church can be efficient in all that it does, but it's not effective. And there's a huge difference between efficiency and being effective.
So that was just for those who didn't hear, the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. So efficiency in getting everything we need to get done, effectiveness in witnessing to our Lord Jesus Christ and loving our neighbour, that sort of thing. Right. Well, no, because I was on the last one there, and then I had a second last one. You'll have to be very good.
It's a very good idea.
Very quick.
The reason why I'm saying this is I happen to have a pen at the time now and that to be the speaker. Now the idea came from this lady, and I think it's a fantastic idea. She's very fortunate. She's got a youth group, and they decided they'd go out from the church, and they established this over 50s group, and they organised stuff for the over 50s group. And it became so popular, it's now called the Young and Hat. And now there's a waiting list to go into this group of young. The point of this is it's the church that's doing that. And I just think to have a youth group that's doing that is absolutely fantastic. End of story.
That's lovely. Thank you. Can we move on to the next slide, please? I'm just conscious that I'm not the last speaker of the day and can't keep you here till bedtime. So just to wrap up what we've said, and those contributions have been fantastic, there's lots of good practice, there's lots of busy churches, there's lots of people in church for whom if you said to them, can you tell me a time when you were lonely and who came alongside you at that time, they would say it was the church community that was there for me. So we have to celebrate good practice, and we have to be sure of ourselves in that companionship that the disciples knew. That is something which we share together as a church, and we do include people, many of whom have times in their lives when they might either be isolated or have a feeling of loneliness. But we also have to remember that even the disciples, even Jesus' absolute hand-picked team, did let him down. And any one of us can find a situation where we have a time when we really need human companionship, but in fact we are isolated or we feel lonely. And I think it's important to remember that that is part of the universal human experience. If it was part of Jesus' life, it can also be part of our life. It may well be a temporary state. And if we do have a time like that in our lives, we can learn from it and be there to walk beside those who might be feeling lonely or anxious in our turn. So one of the best resources for enabling us to build links between the lonely and the isolated is the lonely and the isolated themselves. And we've come across this in all our discussions. The people who come to the sewing group, the 91-year-old lady who used to run a knitting shop, the talent and skill that is out there in our community, but is maybe not managing to get connected, not managing to make friends. I just wanted also to close with the last picture that we have here. What do you see? That's interesting, isn't it? This is dawn. This is a picture of the dawn. And the great thing about the clocks changing is I didn't have to get up early to take it. Our Christian faith is a faith of new life and resurrection. It's a faith of new life and resurrection. If Dorcas' story tells us anything, it tells us that God gives us new life and resurrection. And same too, if we think about the story in the Garden of Gethsemane, what is to come after Good Friday but Easter Sunday? So dawn is the moment that I want you to carry away with you. That dawning opportunity of a new friendship, a new relationship, new skills, new life, new gifts. Please don't go away thinking, I had a talk on loneliness and isolation, but rather see and feel the dawn and the resurrection that comes with faith. I had promised some questions, but we are all out of time, so I will hover at the coffee break, and that might be the best way if you want to catch me then.